Hello, welcome to Judge Class Week number 4. I'm John Aratinji.
And I'm Stacy Winchell. We are both level 2s from Rochester, Minnesota. And today is week 4. And today we will be talking about continuous effects, the interaction of continuous effects, more commonly referred to in the judge circle as layers. But first, before we get to that, John's got a couple things. He's going to explain some Hangout things, and then we're going to go over our practice test from last week.
Oh yeah, if this is your first time watching us live, we have a couple cool things with this platform, Hangouts on Air. So up in this corner, there should be a little 3x3 box of little white boxes. If you click on that, it lets you switch between two neat tools we have for us today. We have our Showcase tool, which currently has a link to the outline for this week's class. And it'll allow us to post any links up in there. We also have a question and answer system, which you can ask any questions you have during the class at any time. We'll be able to see those and answer them. So yeah, take advantage of those things as you wish.
Also, if this is your first time watching us live, if afterwards you want to see any of the previous videos we have, they are listed on the web page that we're using, which is the Rochester Judge class, and those are available, and we recommend watching all of them. They all have great information, and they are working to build a judge candidate towards a level 1 test.
Yes. But let's just hop right into it. So first, let's go over the practice test from last week, week 3, where we talked about copy effects and keyword abilities.
Copy effects and keyword abilities. So first question from our review test is, what are 4 copyable values a permanent has, and what are some copyable values that only spells have? So the copyable values are the name, the mana cost, the color, which is derived from the mana cost with some exceptions, the card types, the abilities on the card, and the power and toughness on the card.
So question number 2, Arnold casts Empty the Warrens, the first spell cast this turn. Nancy uses Twin Cast to create a copy of Empty the Warrens. How many goblins does Nancy get? So Empty the Warrens, it says put 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield, and it has Storm. So when you cast a spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. So she is copying that spell. So the spell is going to be copied exactly as it is, and it's not actually going to be cast. So the Storm trigger would not happen for the copy because it isn't cast. It's just put onto the stack.
No, subtle difference there, but Storm very specifically says when this is cast, and when you copy a spell, you are not actually casting that spell, unless the thing tells you to cast a copy of the spell. Subtle wording difference, it's something, it's an important thing to look for in the copy effects.
And usually if it says cast a copy, it'll be like a card is exiled, and then copy that card, cast a copy of it if able or whatnot.
Yeah. Isochron Scepter is a good example there. Isochron Scepter casts a copy of the card, whereas when I twin cast something, I'm only putting a copy of the spell on the stack. So, all right, third question. Oh, sorry, to fully answer that question, because the Storm count will not trigger, Nancy will only get 2 goblins. Yes. Third question. So Arnold casts Empty the Warrens. The first spell cast this turn. Nancy uses Twin Cast to create a copy of Empty the Warrens. Can Arnold mana leak Nancy's copy of Empty the Warrens? The answer to this is he most certainly can. It is a spell when Twin Cast resolves. You have the copy of Empty the Warrens on the stack. It is a spell, which makes it a legal target for Mana Leak's ability, and he most certainly can Mana Leak her Empty the Warrens.
So question 4. Arabella controls Sky Eel School. She then casts Clone, choosing Sky Eel School as a creature to copy. Does Arabella get to draw and discard a card? So Sky Eel School, it has when it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card. all clone effects, if it enters, it enters as a copy of Skyle's school. So that means that it will get the enter the battlefield abilities for it. The choice happens as it enters the battlefield, so clone will trigger any enter the battlefields.
Mm-hmm. The important thing to remember there is anything that says as it enters happens before anything that says when it enters. So you will get your when trigger.
So question number 5, if I create a copy of a spell with modes, can I change the modes? What about the targets? So the answer is no. Those are locked in on the stack, and they're part of the copyable characteristics of the spell. You get to copy the spell with the chosen modes and targets. Now, often spells will allow you to change the targets of a spell you copy, but if it did not, you would not be able to change the targets, and you can never change the modes.
I actually cannot think of a card in Magic that copies a spell and doesn't also say you may change the targets for that spell. So,
Me neither.
but it is in the rules. If for some reason you get a copy of a spell and it doesn't say specifically you can change the targets, you may not change the targets.
Yes. All right. Question 6. Is Death Touch considered lethal damage? If a creature with Death Touch deals damage in a form other than combat, is the opposing creature still destroyed? What if the Death Touch creature is not on the battlefield? So this is a throwback to previous week. No, this is in the keyword abilities.
Yes, this is keyword abilities.
Yeah. There are a couple of throwbacks in here, but
there's a lot of keyword ability stuff. So.
Yeah. So yes, Death Touch is considered lethal damage. Any amount of Death Touch, as opposed to for regular damage, you have to deal damage equal to the toughness of the creature. And if a creature with Death Touch deals damage in a form other than combat, yes, it does still destroy the creature. Death Touch functions outside of combat as well. And what if the Death Touch creature is not on the battlefield? Well, it will look at the last known information of the card. So what did the Death Touch creature? Well, what did the creature look like when it left the battlefield? If it had Death Touch then it will destroy any creatures it deals combat damage to.
Also important to note, if Death Touch does work from all zones, so if for some reason you have a spell with Death, all right, spell with Death Touch, a bad example, but if you have a creature with Death Touch that has an ability that, let's say you cycle it and then that creature deals damage to something, Death Touch does work from all zones and will still be lethal damage.
Yes.
All right, number 7. What extra steps are created by a creature with double strike attacking? If a creature loses or gains double strike, does it still get to deal regular combat damage? So if you have a creature with double strike, a first combat damage step is created by any creature that has either first strike or double strike in the combat phase. A creature that gains double strike will deal damage in both of the combat damage steps. A creature, if it for some reason loses double strike after the first combat damage step, it will not deal damage during the normal combat damage step. The normal combat damage step specifically says creatures with double strike and creatures that have not yet dealt their combat damage get to deal their combat damage. And since it doesn't have double strike anymore, it would not get to deal combat damage again.
All right. Number 8. At what point can damage trample over a creature to the next creature player in blocking order? Can an attacking player take damage already marked on creatures into consideration when looking at lethal damage? So
once lethal damage is assigned to the block, whoa. And
we skipped down to 9.
Oh.
We had to remove a question because an ability was no longer evergreen. So our numbering is a little bit off.
So it's our answer. Welcome to beta, everybody. So once lethal damage is assigned to the blocker or first blocker in a group, then any and all remaining damage from the trampled creature may be carried over to the player or the next creature in the blocking assignment. You do get to reflect any damage that is currently assigned on the blocking creature when you're figuring out how much damage you need to deal it to create lethal damage. Also, since we're talking lethal damage, if you have Death Touch and Trample, you get to consider that as part of applying lethal damage to a creature when you look at your trample damage. I know when we talked about when we talked about keyword abilities last week, we spent very short amounts of time on several things and a good 20 minutes. Well, felt like 20 minutes on trample. So if you have any further questions on trample, we did pretty well cover it there in week 3. All right, number 9. If a creature with lifelink blocks, when does the player gain the life? Does lifelink function from other zones? And how does lifelink interact with greater than lethal damage? An example, a 5/5 creature with lifelink is blocked by a 2/2. So life gain happens simultaneously when the damage is dealt with lifelink. Lifelink does function from any zone, very similar to Death Touch, as I mentioned earlier. Lifelink will provide its controller with life equal to the full amount of the damage in the example. So the lifelink controller will gain 5 life, even though the 2/2 only needs 2 damage to be considered lethal, because the damage it still deals that creature 5 damage.
All right, so number 11, a bear cub is cast. While on the stack, a player casts Deathlace, targeting the bear cub. What are the characteristics of the bear cub after it resolves? So bear cub,
we don't have a card on our test for it because it's a 2/2 creature with no abilities.
Deathlace, it changes the color of target spell or target permanent to black. So basically, you're changing the color of the bear cub on the stack to black. So the spell is now black, but since it's a permanent, it will enter the battlefield and it will remain black. So any changes to color made on the stack do persist to permanents entering the battlefield.
This is a throwback to, I believe, week number 2.
Yes.
Where we covered the stack and the zones and any of the zone changing effects. Normally when items change zones, they become new objects, but the game remembers anything that interacts with cards on the stack and what happens to them when they come into play. All right. And then, so the Bear Club, to fully answer the question, the Bear Club will be a 2/2 black creature, bear, with a mana cost of green and 1. All right, last question, number 12. A player is trying to control his opponent with Mindslaver. Before Mindslaver resolves, the opponent wants to concede so he doesn't have to show his hand. Can he do this? The answer is yes. Conceding is the only ability in Magic faster than a mana source. You may concede at any time, whenever you like, for any reason, no matter the game state. You can have a lethal attack showing, and you can decide to scoop up your cards and lose. That is well within the rules.
Yes. Yeah, so that is our review.
All right. Do we have any questions about the review? We should peek at that before we move on.
Yeah.
All right.
Doesn't look like anything.
All right. So today we will be talking about layers. So it's important to note. So the goal of this class is to gear you up for taking a level 1 test at the end. Now we're going to go over all of the layers, but I do want to point out that on the level 1 test, they will only be making sure that you can answer questions about layer 7, which is the power toughness layer. It is important to know all the layers because things come up. You know, as a judge, you will get asked questions about layers because layers are kind of counterintuitive in how they work, and it's important to know them and be able, or at least be able to reference where you can look them up to find the answers to questions. But again, for the test, you only really have to worry about layer 7, and we're going to put a lot of our focus of today's class on that.
Yes. So what are layers? So Magic has all sorts of continuous abilities that apply all the time. Like creatures you control get +1/+1. An equipment with equipped creature is indestructible. Like all these things are happening all the time. They're not at any specific point. And we need to know, in certain instances, usually it just all makes sense, but we need to know how they apply for when weird things happen. So the layer system gives us an order of how to apply each of the effects in order. You just go down the list, apply each one first, and then in their spot, and then you go down. There is an exception to that called dependencies. We'll go over that at the very end. But yeah, so we'll get started. So there are 7 layers, and the 7th one, like you said, is the power toughness, everything to do with that. But yeah, let's just dive in.
All right, so our first layer is the copy layer. So this should be fresh in your minds. We did just go over copy effects last week. So obviously a copy effect is anything that says this is a copy of, or this comes into play as a copy of. This is the very first layer, because this very much affects most of the base characteristics of a card. So this is the very bottom layer. So first you check to see if there's any copy effects. So your clones, things like that. I suppose there's the super secret layer 0, which is layer 0 is whatever the card is. But the first layer is copy effects. The second layer is control changing effects. So let's say you have like a control magic. I control. Let's say I have a control magic on John's grizzly bear. It says I control his grizzly bear. This is the point where you would apply the control changing effects. So now, in the layers, working our way up, this is where I now have control of his grizzly bear.
And this matters a little bit because, like, if I have out an enchantment that says all of my creatures get +1/+1, we want to make sure that we know that he has my creature before we apply that effect.
True.
That's pretty common sense, but that's why we have a layer for control.
Yes. Next layer going up is the text changing layer. Now, text changing doesn't happen a lot. Matter of fact, it happens very rarely anymore. But text changing is on cards like Sleight of Mind, things that say you can change a color word or you can change a land type on cards. This is where you apply that, because you want to change those types before you do anything to those cards based on the type of card. Let's say you've got a choke in play and islands don't untap anymore. Well, you'd really like to know if choke has had a Sleight of Mind applied to it, changing it from islands to forests, which would be pretty hilarious, actually. So that's text changing effects, and that's why that one is next.
So after text changing effects, we have type changing effects. So these will modify, whether it's a land, a creature, or any of the subtypes. It might give it, like, it's a zombie in addition to its other types. We're going to apply all that stuff in this layer.
Or changing, like, let's say for some reason your islands have been type changed into forests now, to continue on what happened, to make sure your forests aren't untapping with the choke that's been text changed to. And I've just drawn cross-eyed. But you want to apply these things in the correct order to make sure that the game is working. Maybe our example, maybe it shouldn't be working as intended, but working. It's working as intended actually there with all of our examples.
Yeah.
All right. So our next layer, layer 5. Layer 5 is color changing effects. So this is an effect that changes a card's color for whatever reason. The effect on Spirit Monitor that says it can become the color of your choice until end of turn. This is where you would apply that. And you want to do any of these color changing effects, like let's say there's a Crusade in play, you need to know what color things are at the end of the chain before you apply white creatures get +1/+1.
Yeah. So the next layer, layer 6, is ability adding and removing. So like in our preview on the Facebook page for this, we put the card Humility, which we will be getting into later as much as I don't want to. But
it's not as bad as it used to be.
No.
To be fair, since you brought up Humility, for those of you that have played Magic for a long time, Humility is the reason the layer system exists. It exists. The layer system was created because players and judges and WotC couldn't figure out how Humility interacted with other things. When you had a Humility and 2 Opalescences in play, and your Humility was now a creature that lost its abilities, and everybody's minds exploded. So the layer system was created for that card. Now, things have changed in Magic. It's not as necessary for Humility anymore. Humility is actually one of the lesser problematic examples. We're not going to talk about Life and Limb. If you want to know what Life and Limb does, you can check it out on Gatherer, and it's got a rulings list about 3 pages long because it is worse than Humility.
The ability adding and removing, here we get things like all of our equipments and enchantments, which say like equipped creature gets trample or indestructible. We also have like humility, which says all creatures lose all abilities. Basically anything that's adding or removing abilities goes right here.
And we want to add and remove any abilities before we get to power toughness, because if we're for some reason adding an ability that says other creatures get +1/+1, we need to do that before we get to power and toughness.
Yes.
So, and then layer 7. Layer 7 is power toughness. Now, layer 7 itself is broken into 5 parts.
One.
Did I forget something? Go ahead.
Well, one last note on ability adding and removing. There are some things, we're not going to worry about them too much right now, but they're called characteristic defining abilities. And if you ever run into these, ability, adding, removing, doesn't get rid of them because they're basically like color indicators or, the power toughness printed on the card. So currently in Standard, we have Devoid. If a Devoid creature loses all abilities, it does not lose Devoid. That is basically a color indicator, which is saying this card is colorless.
Yes.
Regardless of anything else, this card is colorless.
Yes.
Similar with Tarmogoyf is a very common example. Causing that to lose all abilities does not, cause its power toughness setting effect to stop happening. Just one thing to note, won't come up very often, but just so you know, especially considering that Devoid is in Standard.
True. Forgot about Devoid and Standard affecting that. So, all right. So then to layer 7. So layer 7A. So first off, so again, power toughness setting effects. This is the important part for the level 1 test. So layer 7A is characteristic defining effects. So like he just said, characteristic defining effects is something on the card that defines what it is, or that defines its power toughness. So like Tarmogoyf is the prime example of this. It states its power and toughness is equal to the number of card types in all yard, or its power is equal to the number of card types in all graveyards, and its toughness is that number +1.
I think in every instance, the power toughness will either have X, X, or star, star, depending on the age of the card, for all of the characteristic defining abilities that are power toughness related.
That is true for having played Magic for a long time. As far as I can think of, like even old cards, like if I can go back to Sutured Ghoul, or even if you go even deeper back into like the original Lurgoyf was star, star +1. So pretty much anything that's a star has a characteristic defining effect which sets its power toughness. And if that's so, that is the first layer of power toughness, which is layer A. Sub-layer A, I should say.
Yes. So layer B, so after we've already applied all our characteristic defining abilities, we know how big our Tarmogoyf starts out as, etc. We go to power toughness setting effects.
So recently, power toughness setting effects, they just recently did a templating change. I think it was in M15 they started doing this. This is, it'll say very specifically it sets the base power toughness of a creature. This is what they're referring to. Now, on older cards older than that, anything that says creatures become XX until end of turn, like on a mirror entity, or on humility says they become 1/1s. This is where that applies. It sets their base power toughness to that number and then applies any other effects on top of that.
Yeah. So after we have, set it with any abilities that just, give us a number, not like plus or minus, just saying what it is, then we're going to modify it. So we can apply our giant gross or our anthem effects. All of our creatures get +1/+1. Like anything which it just gives us a plus or a minus to the power toughness.
Yep.
We're going to apply that right here.
And this can be temporary, like our giant growth example, or it can be a permanent effect, like the Crusade we had earlier, where it gets +1/+1, or if you have a Rancor, enchanted creature gets +2/+0. Well, trample doesn't apply here, but enchanted creature gets +2/+0. Also, any equipment that add to power and toughness would be here. Pretty much anything that gives a plus or a minus. If you're giving enchanted creature -3/-2, can't remember the card name, but I know there's an enchantment that does that. That is where this applies.
With one exception, one thing can give plus and minuses, which do not apply in that layer. Those are counters. So if we have like +1/+1 counters, -1/-1 counters, -0/-1 counters, -0/-2, like
the 90% of counters in Magic are +1/+1 or -1/-1, which is in the next layer. So let's just keep talking about it.
Yeah.
So sublayer D, after we've done the power toughness modifying from that are not counters, then we apply the counters. So +1/+1 counters, -1/-1 counters. If you go deep enough into Magic's history, from the dark ages of Magic, I'll call them, because things like the Dark and Homelands, and they handed out some weird -1, -0/-1 counters, or your Wall of Roots if you're playing Modern. You have your -0/-1 counters. That is where this applies. So you do all your non-counter stuff, then you do all the stuff with counters after that. And that pretty much covers it. Because in Magic anymore, like, there are very few counters that aren't +1/+1 or -1/-1.
yes.
All right.
And the final layer, final sublayer of layer 7, layer 7E, is power toughness switching. So if you have an ability that specifically says switch target creature's power and toughness, this is where we apply that. So we're going to apply everything else first. We're going to apply our giant growths, our rancors, our anthem effects, our Tarmogoyf power toughness. Everything happens before we switch them. That's the very last thing we do.
And this is the part that'll catch people when they. Good example in standard right now is Wandering Fumarole,
Yes.
which is a 1/4, which it has a 0 ability where it can swap its power and toughness. So it's a 1/4. You give it +3/+0. Now it's a 4/4. Okay, well, I'm going to switch its power toughness. Then I'm going to give it +3/+0 again. Well, now it's a 4/7 because layers. Because the order in which these things resolve on the stack doesn't matter. Because layers say you do these things in this order, ignoring timestamp, which we're going to get to timestamp in a second. Timestamp only applies to anything that happens in the same layer, which we will get to in a second. So talking about layer 7 a little bit more, it's important to build it from the ground up every time. Because if you don't, like, that's where the things can get awkward, especially when there's a swap involved. The rest of it seems pretty self-explanatory. The reformatting of power toughness setting effects, knowing that Tarmogoyf is a characteristic defining effect. Most power toughness modifying effects are pretty self-explanatory. They say what you need to do on the card. +1/+1 counters, -1/-1 counters. Even the old weird counters, like, the cards tell you what they do. So it's pretty self-explanatory. It's when the swap happens and you have temporary instantaneous effects that's when it will be confusing and possibly trip people up. So just remember to do all the other things first, no matter what the order is that they resolved in, then do the swap with your power toughness switching effect, and then you're good.
So let's give him an example.
All right.
Okay. So let's give Stacy a bear cub.
All right.
Just that 2/2 creature.
Bear cub is the prime example in Magic Judge questions.
All right. So Stacy, I don't know. What do you want to give your bear cub?
All right. So I have a bear cub. Let's say I'm attacking with it and I'm trying to hit you for damage, and I try and cast a giant growth.
Okay. So I let his giant growth resolve. And then I'm going to cast Sudden Spoiling. His creature loses all abilities and becomes a 0/2 until end of turn.
All right. So because of how this applies, so power toughness setting, 0/2. Then we do our power toughness modifying. I get +3/+3. So right now I'm a 3/5. I decide that sounds cool, but I want to hit you for 2 more damage. So then I'm going to swap my grizzly bear power toughness.
And it should be noted. So like a lot of our instant reactions with, okay, so he gave it +3/+3, and then I turned it into a 0/2. So since the 0/2 is the newest thing, well, that should be the what happens. It should turn into a 0/2. Well, that's not how the layer system works. It's not just on what time it is. We have to go through the specific layers. So CDAs first, then power toughness setting, then power toughness modifying, then +1/+1 counters, then switching it.
It's a little counterintuitive, but especially in that example, just remember sudden spoiling. Sudden spoiling's actual text says it becomes a 0/2. Sudden spoiling's Oracle text says set its base power and toughness to 0/2.
Yes.
Oracle is your friend, because the older Magic cards are, the more they lie to you. That is a good rule to take to heart. For those of you that play Legacy, or for those of you that end up judging Legacy, you will find this to be a very true statement. Oracle text. So John's currently putting up on here
The showcase.
I can't point on a camera, apparently. John's putting on the showcase a link to Gatherer. So Gatherer, since we're talking about it, Gatherer is where you go to find the current updated text on all Magic cards ever. And this will tell you exactly how a card is worded currently. Even if it was only printed like 2 or 3 years ago, if they've updated like a templating, like we think we're getting an updated templating on how to create tokens soon.
We are.
They've confirmed that for us?
Yes.
Okay. We know that we're getting an updated templating on how to create a token in Kaladesh. And so anything that says like put a token into play is going to get updated with Oracle text that says create a token instead. Even though that's a subtle change and it doesn't seem like a lot, 3 or 4 years from now it'll seem like a lot.
What in the world is putting a token? Is that different from creating?
These are things that happen.
Yes.
These are things that people this is a question as a judge you will get asked.
Yeah.
So it's important to know where Oracle is, because then you can be like, well, this is what it used to say. This is what it says now.
And way more relevant once you actually get into the once you actually get into like judging Legacy or even some modern cards.
Becoming more and more
as modern gets older. Yeah.
Does Blood Moon really do that? Yes. Blood Moon really says your land's tapped for red. So yes, it is like kind of got just sidetracked there a little bit. Also important things to know. But yes, though the layer system seems counterintuitive at times, it's important to build it from the ground up, because that's what keeps Magic functioning at the high levels. So last thing that we have on our list here is timestamp order and dependencies. So let's say this is more important in layers that are not layer 7, because in layer 7 the timestamp order usually isn't relevant, because you apply all the things and then you check the state-based effects at the end, which I know we haven't talked about state-based effects. That's coming up in a future week. Don't remember which week off the top of my head, but that does come up in a future week. John is looking it up for us right now. 2 weeks.
2 weeks from
Lesson
now.
6 is the state-based actions. So we'll talk about more about state-based actions then, but when you're applying the layers, it's good to know that you apply all of the layers, figure out all the things that are happening, no matter how complicated your board state may be. And then once you've done all the layer stuff, then you check my brain just froze. Then you check your state-based effects. Literally the thing I'm talking about. So keep that in mind when you're applying things. If for some reason you're with your power toughness modifying or your counters effects, you get where your creature has 0 toughness at some point, don't worry about it until you get to the very end and it still has 0 toughness.
Yeah, so timestamp order, again, in layer 7, this only really matters for the power toughness setting,
True.
because everything else, it doesn't really matter what order it's in. But
Mhm.
if I set his creature to a 0/2, and then later he
I
sets it to a 5/5 with his mirror entity,
Yes.
it will be a 5/5 because the 5/5 ability happened later. It's a newer timestamp. So you apply them in order, the oldest first, then the newest. And like the stack, you know, the newest is ignore the stacking, but
welcome
bad.
to beta. Yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah,
But-
so you look at the timestamp. Whatever has the oldest timestamp, you apply first. Then you apply the newer, the most old from there, then the most old from there. So for some reason, we have 5 different power toughness setting effects. You go in order until you get to the most recent timestamp. Will be the one that is affected or is applied last.
Yes.
And then this is true in all layers. So, like a good example of this is like control changing effects. This is probably where this effect comes up the most often. Let's say I have a grizzly bear that John has decided he wants, so he enchants it with a control magic. I decide I want it back, and I'm also playing blue, so I put my own control magic on it. Well,
I did this a few weeks ago. Well, not necessarily control magic, but I took it somehow.
I'm assuming this is a Commander game.
Yes,
So,
this is Commander.
as a judge, you will learn to love Commander. But yeah, so we have 2 control magics on it. Who gains control of it? Well, this is where our timestamp effect takes place. His applies first to take it from me, but then mine applies afterwards to take it back. So I currently have control of my own grizzly bear with 2 control magics on it. Same is true, again, this is true in a lot of this is more relevant in other layers, like if you have multiple text changing effects, you have sleight of mind that choke 4 times. You apply your sleight of mind from oldest timestamp to newest, and the newest one will then take most precedence. Also true of any type changing effects. Also true of any color changing effects. Those are the layers where that applies far more often.
So the only other thing which we need to be aware of beyond just layer order and what time something happens, dependencies.
So dependencies are difficult to explain, but I'm gonna try. And if I fail at this, I'm just gonna say welcome to beta. So dependencies are, you have multiple effects that want to apply to a certain group of want to apply an effect to a certain group of permanents or cards. The best example I can think of is, let's say I have a Blood Moon, and for some reason I also have an Urborg in play. So Urborg says all lands are swamps in addition to their other types. Blood Moon says non-basic lands are mountains. Why I'm playing both of these, I don't know, but I have both of them right now. So they both try and apply their effect. Now let's say we have a timestamp thing. Blood Moon's actually been in play for a while, and I decide to play my Urborg for my land for the turn. Well, if we were looking at pure timestamp, Urborg would take precedence. But dependency says, well, there's another effect in this layer that's going to change the effect of how Urborg applies to the game, and we need to apply any other effects first in case it modifies it. So Blood Moon's like, hey, I affect all lands. I don't have any dependencies. So Urborg, you're now a mountain. You're now a non-basic mountain. And Urborg's like, well, I don't have anything to apply anymore, so I guess I'm just a non-basic mountain. Dependencies were created while Blood Moon was in standard with Urborg to fix the problem of Urborg with Blood Moon, because it was originally a timestamp effect, and then they created the dependencies section of continuous effects to fix that problem.
Yeah, dependencies don't come up very often, but
when they do, they're complicated. Yeah. Honestly, if you're not sure if there's a dependency, can one of your 2 effects affect the other? Then you apply that effect first. If they both affect each other, I don't even know how that would happen off the top of my head, but if for some reason both effects would affect each other, then you do go back to timestamp. If they're both dependent on each other, then it's just timestamp order to decide what happens.
And it should be noted, dependencies only apply to things happening in the same layer.
Yes, dependencies only affect things that are applying in the same layer. A good example of a timestamp dependency is we're going to go to humility. So humility, opalescence is an enchantment. It says other enchantments have power and toughness equal to their converted mana costs. Humility says all creatures lose all abilities, then humility gains. All creatures are 1/1 creatures. Which is the Oracle text. Does not say that on the card. That's the Oracle text of it. The reason for that is, well, humility broke Magic for a while. So humility. So let's say I have. So opalescence says other enchantments. But if I have two opalescences, they see each other, and so therefore they are both creatures. Now, if there is two opalescences and a humility in play, now they're all dependent on each other for what exactly is happening here. Now, because they're all dependent, you use the timestamp for how they came into play. So let's say I cast, I have the humility in play, then I cast an opalescence, then I cast a second opalescence, and now humility doesn't know what to do. Well, we apply timestamp. First we apply humility, then we apply an opalescence, then we apply an opalescence. Because they are all dependent on each other, you do use timestamp. Now, before that, humility and opalescence, when there's just one humility and one opalescence, there's no timestamp. Humility is like, okay, I'm affecting all creatures. Opalescence is like, well, I'm affecting all creatures, and you're currently a creature, so I have to affect you first.
So humility and opalescence, or
humility.
So it's timestamp.
No, there's a dependency, because if there's one opalescence and one humility, we are literally reading the rulings for humility, because why did I get into this?
So, all right.
You know what? Rather than sitting here reading this ourselves, we're going to tell you, if you want to know more about humility and how it interacts with opalescence, check out the rulings on Gatherer, because that is a far better use of our time on camera.
Here's the one. With the humility and two opalescence.
Yeah, if there's a humility and two opalescences, though there is a dependency, it's all timestamp, because they both depend on all three depend on each other. And if for some reason they all enter the battlefield at the same time, which happened in Standard at the time with a card called Replenish, and could happen with Open the Vaults as well, you choose the timestamp so that you can choose the order, if for some reason they all enter at the same time. So, all right, no more humility. So yeah. Dependencies. The Blood Moon and the Urborg example is the best example. If you have multiple effects that affect like an entire group of cards, and one of those effects is part of that group of cards, you apply the other effect first to make sure it doesn't negate or change how that second effect will apply. That's pretty much the most clear example I can give. And it doesn't happen that often, luckily. Life and Limb is its a whole other ball of wax. Not going to get into that. Same thing. If you want to know more about Life and Limb and how that makes judges cry, you can check that out on Gatherer as well. So
I think there was at some point some interaction I saw about it. I forget the exact cards used, but it was something like all black creatures are zombies, and then something else which turned all of a certain creature type into they also gain like goblin.
Okay, so like all black creatures are zombies, then all zombies are goblins?
Yeah.
Okay. So
in addition to their other types.
Okay. So this case, there is a dependency set up here, because all zombies becoming goblins and all black creatures becoming zombies try and apply in the same layer, because they're both trying to add a creature type. And the one that wants to make all zombies goblins is like, hey, I think I have to wait for you. I have to wait for the other effect, because you're making things zombies and I'm dependent on you making things zombies. Because we apply in the same layer, that's another good example. So you make everything zombies because making all zombies goblins is dependent on that.
Yeah.
So that is another good example.
And one last thing, with timestamps, if you have an enchantment or equipment which moves around, it ends up on a new creature. The timestamp for that enchantment's effects it's trying to apply, or equipment. Equipment will move around more.
Mhm.
It gets a new timestamp when it's attached to a new thing. So if for whatever reason it becomes a 0/1 and loses all abilities, if you then equips an equipment after that, it will get the abilities that equipment will give it.
All right, so let's use Loxodon Warhammer. Loxodon Warhammer is equipped creature, gets +3/+0, lifelink, and trample. So let's say
Darksteel Mutation. Darksteel Mutation.
Darksteel Mutation. All right, Darksteel Mutation is enchanted creature. Base power toughness set to 0/2 and loses all abilities, and and gains indestructible.
Yes,
I believe. So let's say I have a grizzly bear, because why not? I have a grizzly bear with a Loxodon Warhammer, and John puts Darksteel Mutation on my grizzly bear. So because of so currently my Loxodon Warhammer has an older timestamp than his Darksteel Mutation. So my creature at the end of all the layers becomes a 3/1 with indestructible, because Darksteel Mutation gave me indestructible, but I lose all my other abilities. So now let's say I'm like, okay, well that's not cool. I kind of want my lifelink and stuff back. So let's say I have a second grizzly bear that doesn't have the equipment on it, that for some reason can't attack or block. I can move my equipment to a new creature, then move it back, and that sets it to a new timestamp attached to that creature.
Yeah.
Now my creature will still be a 3/1, but it will regain lifelink and trample.
Again, probably won't come up very much, but just something which is good to know.
Let's see. We're not too far short.
I think that's
we're just double checking the Judge Wiki right now just to make sure we haven't forgotten anything important. Though we had an outline set, and I think we covered basically everything.
Yeah.
Dependencies are kind of the hard part. I don't think there's anything about dependencies on the level 1 test. They don't really they don't expect you to know any of that until you get to well, they want you to know it. It's not on the test until you get to the level 2 test. So for the level 1 test, the important things to remember is everything we talked about power toughness. So why don't we review that one more time, since that's the most important thing here. All right, so layer 7, all about power toughness. So 7A, Tarmogoyf, characteristic defining effects. Anything that's got a star in its bottom right corner. Layer 7B, power toughness setting. Anything that says your power toughness becomes 0/2 or becomes XX, or in the modern cards says your base power and toughness becomes this. And Soul Artifact is a good example of that. It says its base power toughness, enchanted artifacts base power and toughness becomes 5/5. That's layer 7B. Then 7C is power toughness modifying. This is everything from giant growth and last gasp to for instant speed effects to your enchantments like Rancor and Moldervine Cloak, because I can't think of a different example, but it's an enchantment that it gives +3/+3. Anything that modifies its power and toughness that isn't counters, because layer 7D is counters. +1/+1, -1/-1, weird old counters. And then finally, always at the very end, and it's really easy to remember, the last thing you do every time is you swap. Layer 7E is swap, the power and toughness switching effects. So that is the most important thing to remember. So for our review, because it's important to know these effects, we will have questions of all the types on the review for next week. But as we get further along, any questions that'll refer back to this week's lesson will focus on power and toughness setting effects.
And I'm going to go ahead and guarantee you we'll probably have a question which is like, okay, so first we're going to switch our Tarmogoyf's power toughness, and then we're going to, we have some +1/+1 counters on there, and now we're going to give it -2/-2, and then we're going to giant growth it, and then we're going to set its power toughness to 0/2, and then we're going to switch its power toughness again, and then we'll give it +5, +0. And then we'll switch it again, just to be on the safe side. So what does it end up as? Just remember, don't go in the order in which things were cast.
Yes.
Just go in the order of the layers. And you will be fine. Just remember, like, even if, setting it to something as the very end or switching it as switching it is the very first thing, because it's supposed to apply last. You need to apply them in the correct order, which is given by our layers.
Yeah.
So.
All right. I believe that covers it for this week. We will have a review test posted up on our site on Friday. So if you want to take a look at that, it's a really good tool for reviewing and kind of like any of the reviews, going through them and answering them, and then kind of watching along with us in the following video to go over the answers. It's a good tool for learning the info. Actually, before we quit, I was about to kind of wrap us up. We should check for questions because we have not recently.
Yes.
All right. No questions today. I know a lot of you have been watching us, not necessarily watching us live, but watching the videos afterwards. So if there are any questions, you can also post those to the webpage, to the Facebook group as well, correct?
It's a page, so you can post on there. We'll see it, or you can message us.
Messaging us is better.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you have any questions about any of this, which this is actually a relatively complicated week. This is actually one of the more complicated concepts that exists out there, which is why, like, our notes that we have over here, it's not a lot of stuff. It's literally just the layers in order as compared to some other weeks. But there's a lot of things that go on in there, and it is rather complicated. So if you have any questions, feel free to message us, and we'll be happy to answer any of them for you.
And for the sake of the other viewers, we'll probably bring them up during class next week. So.
All right. Well, I think that does it for us for this week. I'm Stacy Winchell.
I am John Aratinci.
And thank you for watching Magic Online Judge Class Beta.